Join Sam and Will as they bring the Bible's stories to life through historical evidence and try not to feel out of place in a car garage, all while bringing you Under the Hood. Hey, Will, you see this?
Yeah.
This is an Egyptian papyrus that I got while I was in Egypt.
Does that make you feel smart?
Well, yeah, it does.
Sam, what are we doing here?
What we're doing here, this papyrus is old, and somebody came along and decided to paint all this with new colors and make it bright and vibrant. And these cars are old, and somebody came along and wanted to make them new and to repaint them, and it fits the theme.
So just like usual, really what you're saying is because we're pastors, somebody's letting us film here for free.
Well, yeah, but it's still cool, right?
Really cool.
Welcome to Under the Hood. I'm your host, Will Bushman. I'm here alongside Sam Cashman. Sam, what are we getting into today?
So today we're going to be talking about something that's really fascinating. It's the plagues of Egypt, which might not sound fascinating to most people. Most people, like you're racing through, there's 10 of them that God unleashes on Egypt for the purpose of getting his people freed from their slavery under Pharaoh. But the more you study these plagues, you see that they're not just meant to be punishments on the people of Egypt. They're actually meant to be evangelistic, where God is calling the Egyptians to walk away from their gods. And every single one of the plagues has a message that to modern readers, we read right past, but to the ancients, they would have seen something really profound.
Okay, so before we even get into all of that, we first have to get to the fact that how did Israel end up in slavery?
So the end of the book of Genesis has Jacob with his 12 sons that become the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, one of those sons is elevated to become one of the more powerful people in Egypt, and he saves all of Egypt from a famine. And his brothers travel into Egypt to be rescued from the famine as well, because Joseph had stored up grain. Well, what ends up happening is Joseph, selling the grain to the Egyptians, buys their land and buys their animals. He buys everything from them because they're so desperate. And it says that Joseph reduced all of Egypt to slavery. So the irony is you have the Hebrew that reduces Egypt into slavery, and generations go by. Pharaoh has all the power, and eventually it turns and bites the Hebrews, and then they're going to be enslaved because they're growing so numerous. The Egyptians fear them, and they say, we need to put taskmasters over them. And so what they started, growing this government to be wildly big, turns on them, and they end up getting enslaved, and they're going to be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. And so when we get to the plagues, it's when God is raising up a deliverer, Moses, and the plagues are God equipping Moses to lead his people to freedom.
So Moses is going to be the deliverer of God's people. So how does Moses really get involved in all this?
So God comes to Moses when he's 80 years old, and God appears to him in a burning bush, and he tells Moses, I am going to send you back to Egypt, and you're going to confront Pharaoh, and you're going to lead my people out. Moses is thinking, I'm the last guy in the world that's capable of doing this. And God assures him, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to give you signs. You're going to be able to perform things that gives you credibility in front of the audiences that you're in front of. So he tells him, you're going to go in front of the Israelites, and you're going to prove that you're the deliverer that I've sent. And he says, I'm going to give you 3 signs. And so he performs those signs, and the last of which is going to be important later on. But it says, take some water from the Nile and pour it down on the ground, and it will become blood. And that's a wild sign. Like that's a miracle. And that's going to be the first great miracle that Moses does in front of Egypt, as he turns water into blood, which is, it draws our mind to think of the first miracle that Jesus will do at Cana, where he turns water into wine, which in the Bible is symbolic of blood. So the two are talking to one another. But this leads into these 10 plagues that God is going to unleash upon Egypt for the purpose of delivering his people from slavery.
Yeah, because a lot of times you think, why would God, of all people, come to this nation? Even if the people of Israel are enslaved, it just seems wrong of God to unleash 10 plagues on this community.
Yeah, we just assume, this is Old Testament. God's angry. He's the punisher. He's coming to lay down justice on to the Egyptians. But if you read carefully when you're in Exodus, listen to what he says. When he's right before he starts unleashing the plagues, listen to his purpose statement. He says, then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment, I will bring out my divisions, my people, the Israelites. And then listen to this. and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against the land and bring the Israelites out of it. So buried in this is him saying, they're going to know that I'm the Lord. And as we see through this episode, when we get into the plagues, he's going to show them that he's the true God by showing them that their pantheon of gods are not the true gods.
Okay, so let's get into it. The first plague, what was it?
So the first plague is turning the Nile to blood. So Moses' sign, pouring water onto the ground that turns to blood. The first great plague upon Egypt is turning the Nile to blood, which would be like, if you imagine if you're there and all of a sudden you see the Nile River and all the tributaries and lakes and buckets, every bit of water in the land turns to blood. And you think, okay, what is the purpose of that? What is the purpose of that? And so if you were to jump into a time machine and you went back 3,500 years to Egypt and you told the Egyptians that the Nile was turning to blood, they would have been excited. They would have been blown away because they believed that the Nile River was actually the bloodstream of one of their great gods, the god of the afterlife, the god of resurrection, Osiris. And so the Egyptian mythology said that once a year, because in Egypt, it was essential for the Nile to flood and to inundate the land with floodwaters so that they could do farming. And so when that would happen, the Nile flows from the south to the north. And as it floods, it picks up all the red silt and clay and everything else. And by the time it gets to northern Egypt, the Nile does have kind of a reddish tint. And so their mythology said Isis, his wife, was so sad that Osiris had been put to death that she weeps, and all this water is poured into the Nile, and it begins to flood. And Osiris is chopped up into 14 parts, and he's thrown in, and it's his body, his blood, that then goes through the Nile, and that bloody water brings life to Egypt. And so when you're in Egypt and you hear that this great contest is going on between this guy Moses, who used to be a prince of Egypt, and Pharaoh, they're going at it against each other, and then all of a sudden the Nile actually turns to blood. If you're an Egyptian, you're going, oh my goodness, our God is coming alive. The Nile is actually turning to blood. They're about to go at it. Except what happens in the plague? The Nile River begins to rot, and all of the fish die, and everything in it reeks, and it's awful. Well, now, on this hand, you were excited when the Nile turned to blood because your God is coming to life to fight for you, your God of heaven and the afterlife. But now that blood is rotten, which means your God is dead. Your hope of an afterlife, gone. And that's the first plague upon the Egyptians, is God saying, you're putting all of your hope in Osiris to lead you to heaven. Let me disabuse you of that false notion. He is not alive. He is dead, and I am the God that can show you he is powerless to save you. And buried in that, God is saying, turn to me. Osiris cannot help you.
You would think that would be enough.
Right? That's a pretty big miracle. And yet,
9 more.
9 more to come. And almost after every single one of these times, this is going to become a familiar theme. God goes, okay, how about now? And it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And we're going to see that again and again. And so God says, okay, here's another plague.
Okay, so the first plague, the Nile turning into blood is kind of bizarre, but honestly, all of them are pretty weird.
They're all weird. Like, if you don't know why God is doing this, they just seem random and bizarre.
Yeah, because even plague 2 is frogs, right?
Yeah.
Frogs of all things after the Nile turned to blood seems kind of like a letdown, but what would this have meant to them?
Yeah, I mean, you got to think, if you're a god and you're going to essentially conquer a nation and you send frogs, take a moment to step back from this, and it's like, ooh, not frogs, what are we, 7-year-old girls? Oh no, not a frog. But there's a very, very intentional thing that's going on here. So the first plague takes Osiris out, who is the god of the afterlife. Well, in Egypt, Hecht is the god of fertility for this current life, and Hecht is part man, part frog, and so you see images of Hecht, and the idea is Hecht brings new life in this world. And so when you're reading the scriptures, there's a reason why it says the Nile will teem with frogs. They'll come up into your palace and into your bedroom and onto your bed. Well, if Hecht is a god of fertility, That makes sense why it's stressing that the frogs are all over the bed. So the other part of this is if the first plague with the Nile turning to blood takes away your drinking water, like all of the lakes and buckets and everything else, all the water has turned to blood where you can't drink. Plague number 2 comes along and it says that the frogs go down into the ovens. And in ancient Egypt, your oven would be dug down into the ground. But in Egypt, frogs are so sacred that the penalty for killing a frog is the death penalty.
Oh, wow.
So you can't cook. So the first plague takes away your afterlife. The second plague takes away any new life here, your fertility. The first plague makes the waters reek from the blood coagulating. The second plague, when all these frogs die, it says that they're heaped into big mounds and the whole land reeks. So you got the water reeking, the land reeking. Afterlife, present life. And you have no water to drink, no food to eat. And so in these first 2 plagues, God is decimating the Egyptian gods. And again, when you see frogs everywhere, if you're an Egyptian, you're like, Hecht! Hecht is coming to our defense. And then all the frogs die and they're rotten. And so your God of afterlife and fertility are both defeated.
Yeah, so God's making it very clear who's holding the power here through these plagues.
That's right. And so we're going to kind of race through some of these. But plague number 3, which is going to be lice. The Hebrew word means small bug, so sometimes you'll hear it gnats. What that meant was that when it covers the priest head to toe, they're declared unclean. And in Egypt, you had to be perfectly clean to go and worship their gods. So you know what God has done by covering people with lice or gnats?
No worship.
No worship. You're not going to go worship these gods. Then plague 4, this one's really wild, is scarab beetles. Sometimes you hear flies. It's larger bugs, which in Egypt, because the scarab is so sacred, it's almost certainly talking about a scarab beetle. But the god Khepri was what took the form of a scarab beetle. And what Khepri would do is push the sun across the sky. And in Egyptian mythology, this is a little wild, but they believed that the sun was like a dung ball, right? And so a dung beetle or a scarab beetle goes into a pile of poo, gets a nice snack, rolls it with its head, pushing it across. And so they believe that Khepri was a god that rolled the sun across the sky like a dung beetle pushing a ball of dung. And so now that god's really important to the Egyptians. He's dead, right? So all of these, the personification, right? The when they come to life, they all die. Then you get to the 5th plague. And when you look at the 5th plague, it's the plague upon the livestock. Well, why is that significant in Egypt? Well, a lot of their major gods take on the form of livestock. You've got gods like Ptah and Hathor and Hesat. And these gods, what happens in the 5th plague? You have livestock just, they're all dropping dead, which means all of those gods in the pantheon are collapsing. Then the next plague, the 6th plague, is going to be boils. And so all of Egypt's gods that look to health, the big gods like Isis, failing because all of Egypt is covered in these painful sores and boils. They're on the bottom of their feet, which means they can't do business. They can't walk around. They can't get comfortable. They are in constant reminder that their gods are failing.
And you would think, again, obviously this would be enough. Now I'm inflicted with boils. There's frogs everywhere. Death seems to be surrounding me. But yet again, we see that Pharaoh is hardening his heart time after time.
And as the plagues go, the people turn against Pharaoh. The magicians turn against Pharaoh. His inner counselors turn against Pharaoh. And now you have this one man who wants to go to war with God and refuses to relent, even though he's given opportunity after opportunity. And so now these plagues start getting a little bit more intense. Plague number 7 comes along, and it's raining down fire and hail from the heavens, which fire is probably lightning, right? But it's coming down and it's destroying everything. In Egypt, you don't get major storms with hail and stuff. Like, it's a dry climate. So this would have been very much out of the ordinary, but everything's getting decimated. This hailstorm decimates all the crops. It sets fire to so much stuff. And so now all the gods of weather and the sky and agriculture, where are you? Defeated. They are powerless to spare them. And the next plague, what hasn't been totally destroyed by the hail, the locust, a swarm of locusts comes along, and the gods of agriculture are failing. All the grain and everything throughout Egypt is taken away, and now Egypt is crippled because of this man's pride. But there's still two major gods in the Egyptian pantheon that are still left. What's the most famous god of all of Egypt?
Ra.
Ra, the god of the sun. And so as Pharaoh persists, now all of a sudden God says, you're still standing against me. And all of Egypt is saying, we still have Ra. And in the 9th plague, God blots out the sun for 3 days. Even Ra is now defeated. The last god standing is Pharaoh himself. In Egypt, they believed that Pharaoh was a god. And so God actually sends Moses to plead and beg, because to this point, all of these plagues, you can recover from them. But this last plague is devastating. It's the death of the firstborn. And it's going to be the one that humiliates Pharaoh in front of all of his people. It's the God Yahweh coming through Moses saying, turn, let my people go. And Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he absolutely refuses. And Moses announced that this last plague, if he refuses to soften his heart to God, it's going to result in the death of the firstborn throughout all of Egypt. And Pharaoh says, no, he still wants to war against God. And then he is proven powerless to save even that which is most precious to him, his son. And so if you're an Egyptian and you're watching from the outside, all of Egypt has already been angry at Pharaoh. They've been begging him to stop, and he's refused. And now the God of the Hebrews has shown that every one of your gods that you have worshiped, that you have trusted in your whole life, is a mirage. There's no substance behind them. He is the one who controls the afterlife. He's the one who controls fertility. He is the one who has power over weather in the sky and all of it. And so these plagues, in a sense, are evangelistic. He's tearing down idols.
So we see God is slowly taking out all of the idols and the gods of Egypt, but we know he does that for us too.
Yeah. I mean, if I were to tell you my story of how I come to put my trust in Christ, it's not because I was really smart and life was going amazing and I thought, yeah, let's go get Jesus too. My life was, I had all these idols and I was trusting in money and I was trusting in relationships and power and all these things that I thought would make my life satisfying. And then slowly but surely, God came to each and every one of those idols and began wrecking my life. I look back at it and my job, during 9/11 tragedy, my job got turned upside down. All of my relationships got turned upside down. For a season, my relationships with my parents were upside down. My job became precarious. And all of these idols where I was searching for significance and meaning, they all got taken away from me. And in hindsight, that made me think, where can I go to find identity? Where can I go to find any security? Because all these things have failed me. And I can look back in my life and I can see, man, God tore down all the idols that I had in my life, not because he's mean, but because he loves me too much to share me with another that's never going to satisfy me. And it's that heart of God that comes into Egypt, who loves the Egyptians, which is hard for us to see when bad things happen. How is this love? But God begins tearing down their idols because he wants them to come to him every bit as much as he tore down my idols because he wanted me to come to him.
And so we can really break this down to, we have Pharaoh who just is stubborn. Like, his heart is literally hard that all of this calamity happened because one man just wouldn't see what was in front of him.
Yeah. And so if you read through the story of the plagues, that's one of the statements that happens again and again. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Sometimes it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And you read that and you're like, that's kind of harsh. But there's a message behind that also comes to life when you know a little bit about Egyptian mythology. So there's a guy named Ani who writes the Book of the Dead around 1550 BC. And he uses himself in the book to kind of say, this is how you go about getting to heaven. And one of the first things that you have to do is your heart is taken out of you and it's laid on one side of a scale and it's weighed against a feather. And it's called the feather of truth, the feather of Ma'at. And if your heart is heavier than the feather, then there's this creature called Amut, who's part lion and part hippo and part crocodile, because the Egyptians are creative.
Yeah.
That if your heart is heavier than a feather, this creature devours you and you lose your everlasting life.
So God's making this judgment call if we take it back to Pharaoh, where a hard heart would be a heavy heart, wouldn't
Yeah. So it's not just that he's hardening the heart. The Hebrew word behind that is kaved, and it literally means to be heavy, to be weighed down. And so in that, God is saying, I'm going to make Pharaoh's heart heavy. Well, if you're an Egyptian, how do you hear that? Uh-oh. If it's heavy, it's going to be heavier than the feather. And it's like God is using the Egyptian lingo to bring judgment on Pharaoh. What he's saying is that man has an unworthy, heavy heart, and I'm going to judge him. And it's just stubborn. It's at war with God.
And the rest of the Hall of Judgment really tells us more about the Egyptian mind and culture.
When we think Egypt and this, everything, we think bad people. But if you study, they're actually super moralistic.
Huh.
And that's surprising to us, right? So when you died, one of the things that Ani has to do is he has to go to 42 different gods of Egypt. And in front of every one of them, he's got to make a case that he did not violate a particular rule. And it's like, if you got to keep all standards here, or you lose your hope of eternal life. And let me just give you some samplings of what you had to be able to profess in front of the gods. I have never transgressed the law. How you doing? I've never stolen. I've never uttered lies. Are you making it?
Not yet.
I mean, we're all out. I've never committed adultery. I've never made anyone weep. I've never attacked a man. I've never been an eavesdropper. We're
We're
gone.
done.
We're gone. I've never slandered a man. I've never been angry without a cause. I've never polluted myself. I've never shut my ears to the words of truth. I've never acted in a hurry without a reason. I've never pried into matters. I've never done any evil, never raised my voice, never cursed God, never acted with arrogance. If you're guilty of any of these things and the gods find out, you have no hope of an afterlife, which means, it's essentially the same kind of feel that you get from the Old Testament where God says, be perfect as I am perfect. And you just come across it and you say, there's no chance. There's no chance that I'm going to be able to measure up. And so in Egypt, they came up with a way that you would lie to the gods. You would actually cover your heart with an amulet that said, heart, don't fail me now. Don't betray me by revealing that I've broken these laws. And you would lie to the gods in the hopes that they would not detect that you're lying to them when you say that you've done these things. So even among the Egyptians, they know they don't measure up, but they have no hope of atonement. So they have to deceive the gods. It's pretty wild. And so as you make your way past the gods and the incantations and the feather of truth, you ultimately get to the end of the Hall of Judgment where Osiris is reigning from the throne and he has ultimate control over your afterlife. And God comes and says, no, the whole point of the gospel, the whole point of the Old Testament, he comes and says, it's not about whether you're good enough. You'll never keep all the rules. Your only hope of heaven is my faithfulness and my willingness to provide a way for you to make it into heaven. It's the counter Egypt. So Egypt says you got to be good enough. God's coming and says, you'll never be good enough. You'll never measure up, but I'm going to provide for you.
Okay, so we've talked about the plagues. We've seen that God had a purpose in them, tearing down the gods of Egypt. We've looked at the Hall of Judgment. But the real question is there any way to know, or are there any other explanations of how all this could have happened?
Yeah, when you study, especially recently, some of the archaeological stuff that they're finding, there's increasing evidence of the slavery. There's increasing evidence of the exodus out of Egypt. But in terms of the plague specifically, there actually is some compelling evidence that I think shows the plagues of Egypt from biblical times. So there's a lot of people who come to it and they try to dismiss the plagues as being divine, and they'll come up with naturalistic explanations. Like there was a very famous volcano that happened a little bit earlier than where we want the timeline, but it was so massive that people theorize, well, maybe this volcano blew up and it so disrupted the ecology that it produced a red algae, and that made the Nile River turn red. And then maybe that, made all the frogs leave the water and it killed all the fish, and then the frogs all died, and then it got lots of bugs, and the bugs went out and infected the cows, and then the people got boils because of the sickness in the cows, and they try to play that all out, but eventually you get 3 days of darkness where it's only dark over the Egyptian spots, and the death of the eventually it becomes like this has to be supernatural, and you can't explain it all away naturalistically, and that kind of defeats the whole purpose. the point of this is that God is doing supernatural things and he's defeating the gods of Egypt. There's something that's been discovered that's called the Ippawar Papyrus, and it's housed in the Leiden Museum. And when you read the Ippawar Papyrus, like even in its case in the museum, it's referencing the biblical plagues upon Egypt because it's just that good. So I'm going to read to you some statements, and you tell me, like, this could have been reading out of the Bible if you didn't know the Bible well. Like, it just captures it. So at the beginning of the Exodus story, remember that the Egyptian soldiers are told to take the Hebrew baby boys and to throw them in the river. So listen to the summary of Ippawar as he walks through not only that, but the plagues. He says, many dead are buried in the river. The stream is a sepulcher, a tomb. He says the river is blood. Why do you say that? The river's blood. Indeed, pestilences throughout the land, all animals, their hearts weep. The cattle moan because of the state of the land. So in this document that's written 1200 BC, there's a problem with the cattle. Everywhere the barley has perished, which is interesting because that's saying the barley sprouted. So it's not a drought. It's not like nothing is, it sprouted, but it perished, almost like hail killed it or locust took it away. The storehouse is empty. The gates, the columns, the walls are burnt up. Gee, there was a plague of fire from on high. The land is without light. What do you think Ippawar was getting at there? Like, when do you say the land is without light? He says the children of princes, remember the 10th plague, are dashed against the walls. Groaning is throughout the land mingled with laments. And then it says at the end of the Exodus, we're told that the Egyptians actually love the Israelites. They're so angry at Pharaoh that they favor the Israelites and they begin giving them clothing and gold and silver. Even when the Israelites are asking for it, they're like, please. And so they plunder them. And it says gold and lapis lazuli, silver and turquoise are strung on the necks of the maidservant. What's a maidservant? It's a slave. And so now all of a sudden the slaves have all the jewelry. Indeed, poor men have become the owners of wealth. The king, Pharaoh, has been deposed by the rabble, so the poor people, raised in a stink, have overthrown the Pharaoh. And then listen to the last one, because this is wild. Remember what, among the first signs that was to be given to Egypt, God told Moses, I want you to go there and I want you to take some water from the Nile, and then you pour it out and it will turn to blood, and that's how all this got started. So in this papyrus, Ippawar, who's an Egyptian sage, says this, behold, Egypt is fallen to the pouring of water, and he who poured water on the ground has carried off the strong man in misery. All is in ruin. And so when you read the Ippawar Papyrus, written 1,200 years before Jesus, and just after the period where we should find Moses, I mean, it's like reading the newspaper. What do you make of this? So yeah, I think there is evidence to support these plagues.
Okay, so we're looking at real plagues, supernatural plagues brought about by God. But I remember at the beginning we said these weren't just for the sake of their own sake, but there's a purpose that God has for the Egyptians in all of this. So the question is, does God fulfill that purpose?
Yeah. So one of the things is as he's tearing down the Egyptian pantheon and he's wrecking everybody's idols, it would just be mean if nothing good came out of this. But we're told when we get to the passage where the Exodus is about to happen that a mixed multitude, meaning many nationalities, foreigners, came up out of Egypt with them. So when Moses leads the Israelites, it's not just the Israelites. There's going to be Ethiopians and Cushites and Egyptians that are looking at what the Hebrew God has just done, and they're saying, we want to be with his people. We want to give our lives to that God and to be a part of his covenant. And so the evangelistic purpose of these plagues bore fruit, and many foreigners come out with the Israelites and go with them through the Red Sea into the wilderness. In fact, one of the things that you find in Scripture in Numbers chapter 12, Moses, when his wife dies, he actually marries a Cushite woman who would have dark skin. She's from south of Egypt. She would have had dark skin, and Aaron and Miriam are upset about it, that he's not marrying an Israelite, and they give him grief about marrying a Cushite, a black woman. And God comes to his defense and says, absolutely, he can marry one of these people because they're one of my people, which is pretty wonderful.
It's amazing. All right, Sam, so we've covered a lot of ground, but we know one of our stated goals is always to take all of the Bible and to get us to point back to Jesus. So how is that going to happen this time?
When God is laying down all of these plagues upon Egypt, he is showing them, I want you to come to me because I'm a far better God. And remember, Egypt is moralistic. They've got to strive. They've got to be good enough to get to heaven. And buried in these plagues is almost like this hidden prophecy that's pointing you to Jesus, because Jesus is going to be the one who takes on the far greater plague. You know, we look at frogs, or we look at the Nile turning to blood, and we're like, why would God do that to these people? But it's nothing that God won't take upon himself, and even more so. So let's look at the plagues. And the first plague is a God whose blood is poured out to bring life to all of Egypt, right? It's Osiris whose blood is poured out. It's his bloodstream that brings life to Egypt, except Osiris fails. He's a dead God, but we serve a God whose blood is poured out to bring life to the ends of the earth. You think of the ninth plague, like the plague on Ra, where God is going to come and blot out the sun for 3 days. And what would all of Egypt think? Our God was dead for 3 days. Well, does that remind you of anything? And so God is saying, all these plagues that I'm laying down upon Egypt, I'm ultimately going to take up myself. I'm going to be the God who is dead for 3 days. And then you get to the last plague, the harshest of all plagues, where God is going to take the firstborn son of Pharaoh so that his people can go free. And what do you see in Jesus? You see the firstborn Son of God who willingly lays down his life and suffers death so that his people can be freed from their bondage to sin and death. And he will destroy the grave and conquer it all and give us freedom to where we don't have to come into a hall of judgment someday, white-knuckling it, saying, I was good enough, I was good enough. You know why? Because the God who died for us and stayed dead for 3 days and rose triumphantly, defeating sin and death, looks at us and gives us his perfection. And he takes all of our sin and our curse and our plagues upon himself. He's that good.
And it's really beautiful that a story that from the outside really just seems like pure destruction. But we come to a God who, it's actually his kindness that's going to bring those Egyptians, those Cushites, to repentance, that they can find true life, that they walk away from those idols, to those gods that are lifeless, that are mute. And he uses their own language, their own world, their own culture to bring them into his family. It truly is beautiful.
Thanks for watching. Join us next time as we go under the hood of another story in the Bible.